moment my uncle's lawyer read out that single line from the will, I felt the floor tilt under me. Not metaphorically. I actually had to grab the back of the chair in front of me to stay upright. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to where this really started. Not the lawyer's office, but a Tuesday afternoon in October, when I was 28 years old, sitting at my mom's kitchen table in Sudbury, watching my uncle walk to her front door like he owned it. Which, as it turned out, was exactly what he had in mind. My mom's name is Elaine. She raised me alone after my dad passed when I was 11, pancreatic cancer, fast and brutal. It was just the two of us for years, in that house on Elm Street with the green shutters that always needed repainting and the back porch that sagged a little to the left. We were close the way people get close when there's nobody else. She worked as an administrative coordinator at the school board for 30 years. Careful with money, careful with everything. She had a small RRSP, the house paid off, and a pension she was 2 years away from collecting. My uncle, my dad's younger brother, had drifted in and out of our lives since the funeral. He'd show up at Christmas, stay 3 days, borrow $200, disappear until spring. Mom always let him in. She said he was the last piece of my dad she had left. I never argued with her about it. Maybe I should have. His name is Roland. He was 54 when he came back into our lives properly after a long stretch in Alberta that he was vague about. Something in oil and gas, he said. A consulting contract that fell through. Bad timing, the economy, you know how it is. He smiled when he said it. That easy practice smile. And Mom nodded like she understood. And I sat there watching him and feeling something tighten in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. He started coming around every week. Then twice a week. He'd bring groceries sometimes. Nothing expensive. A bag of apples, a box of red rose tea. Mom would light up when she heard his truck in the driveway. I think she was lonely in a way she never said out loud. Her sister lived in Victoria. Her friends from work had scattered. I was 40 minutes away in a one-bedroom apartment in Garson, working as a dental hygienist, coming over on weekends when I could. I noticed things, but I told myself I was being uncharitable. I noticed that Roland never offered to fix the porch, even though he mentioned 3 separate times that he used to do renovation work. I noticed that Mom started referring to her saving situation in vague, slightly anxious terms when she'd never talked that way before. I noticed that Roland always seemed to be there when I arrived, and always had a reason to leave when I tried to talk to Mom alone. The first concrete thing happened in February. I came over on a Saturday and found Roland at Mom's kitchen table with a folder of papers spread out in front of him. Mom was making tea with her back to me. Roland looked up and smiled and said, "We're just going over some financial planning. Nothing complicated." I sat down and asked what kind of financial planning. He explained patiently, like I was slightly slow, that Mom's money was sitting in a basic savings account earning almost nothing, and that he knew someone, a colleague from his Alberta days, who specialized in private investment vehicles that could significantly grow her retirement funds. He slid a brochure across the table. It looked professional. It had a Calgary address. I picked it up and said I'd like to look into it before Mom made any decisions. Roland smiled again and said, "Of course, no pressure at all." Mom set the tea down and said, "Don't worry so much, sweetheart. Roland knows what he's doing." I took the brochure home and spent that evening trying to find the company online. The website existed but was thin. No physical reviews, no registration I could verify with the OSC, no names of actual staff. I called the number on the brochure the following Monday. A man answered on the 3rd ring, very smooth, very polished. When I asked specific questions about the fund structure and provincial registration, the answers got circular. I thanked him and hung up and called a financial advisor I knew from the dental office. Her husband worked at a credit union, and read him the brochure over the phone. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "This has the shape of an affinity fraud. I wouldn't touch it." I drove to Mom's house that Wednesday evening. Roland was there. I told Mom I was worried about the investment and I'd had someone look at it and I didn't think it was legitimate. Roland tilted his head. and looked at me with this expression of patient disappointment, like I was a teenager making a scene at dinner. He said he understood I was protective of my mother, but that I was out of my depth here, and maybe I should trust that the adults in the room had things handled. I looked at my mom. She looked at her hands. I drove home and sat in my parking lot for 20 minutes before I could go inside. After that, things shifted in a way that was hard to describe to anyone who hadn't watched it happen slowly. Roland started framing me as the problem. Not directly, not cruelly, but in that steady drip way that eventually reshapes how a person sees themselves. Mom would call and mention, almost casually, that Roland thought I was stressed, that maybe I was projecting, that it wasn't healthy for me to be so worried all the time. Little phrases that weren't hers. She'd never used the word projecting in my entire life. I kept showing up. I brought food. I stayed for dinner when Roland was there, and I watched him, and I kept my mouth pleasant and my eyes open. The money question came to a head in April. Mom called me on a Thursday night, voice bright and slightly rushed, to tell me she decided to consolidate some of her savings into the investment Roland had recommended. Just a portion, she said. $50,000. I said, Mom, please don't do this until we've talked properly. She said Roland was right there and maybe I could talk to him. He took the phone and said with perfect calm, Olivia, your mother is a grown woman. This is her money and her decision. You don't have to agree with it, but you do have to respect it. I said, Roland, I love my mother and I'm asking you as her daughter to give us some time before she moves that money. There was a pause. Then he said, I think the three of us need to sit down and set some clearer boundaries. I went over the next morning. Mom was in the kitchen. Roland was in the living room watching something on TV, and when I walked past him, he didn't look up. Mom and I sat at the kitchen table, and I tried carefully, quietly, without attacking him, to explain what the financial advisor had told me, what I'd found when I'd researched the company, what the warning signs were. Mom listened. Her hands were folded on the table. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, He's been so good to me, Olivia. You don't see how lonely I've been. I reached across and held her hands and said I knew. I said I wasn't trying to take anything from her. I just wanted her to be safe. She said she'd think about it. I found out 3 weeks later that she'd transferred the money anyway. I want to be honest here. I almost gave up. There's a particular exhaustion that comes with watching someone you love make a decision you can see is going to hurt them and not being able to stop it. I cried in my car a lot that spring. I called my friend Danny in Halifax and talked in circles for an hour. I saw a counselor twice and she helped me understand that I couldn't control what my mom chose to do. I could only control what I was willing to see and document. Document. That was the word that unlocked something. I started keeping notes. Dates, times, what was said, what I observed. I saved every text message. I started taking photos when I visited. Nothing dramatic, just the interior of the house, things that were there and then weren't. A set of silver candlesticks that had been on the dining room hutch since I was a child, gone by June. When I asked, Mom said she'd given them to a neighbor. She couldn't remember which one. In July, Mom fell. She was coming down the back porch steps and her ankle turned and she went down hard. It wasn't serious. A bad sprain, no break. But she needed help getting around for 2 weeks. I took time off work and stayed at the house. Roland was there constantly, and for those 2 weeks I got to watch him up close in a way I hadn't before. He managed her medication. He was the one who picked up her prescriptions and set out her bills. He monitored who called, answering the phone himself half the time and telling me afterward who it had been, like he was filtering her contact with the outside world. Her sister Helen called from Victoria and Roland told her Mom was resting and he'd have a call back. He never mentioned it to Mom. I only found out because Helen texted me, worried she hadn't heard back. I stood in Mom's bathroom the third night I was there, looking at her medication bottles, and I had a thought I didn't want to have. I turned it over and looked at it and put it back down, and then picked it up again. Mom's GP was Dr. Whitmore, a woman she'd been seeing for 12 years. I called the office the following Monday after Roland had gone out for groceries and asked to speak with her. The receptionist said she couldn't discuss a patient. I said I understood. I wasn't asking for information about my mother. I just wanted to flag something to the doctor as a family member and ask if there were resources for this kind of situation. The receptionist put me through. Dr. Whitmore was careful, but she was kind. She said she noticed some changes in Mom's presentation over the past several months. She said she appreciated me reaching out. She said there were processes available to her as a physician and she would be paying close attention. I don't know exactly what happened between that conversation and August. But in August, Dr. Whitmore referred Mom to a specialist for what she described as some fatigue and cognitive concerns. Mom told me this herself, a little puzzled, saying she felt fine. The doctor was probably being overly cautious. Roland frowned when she mentioned it and said he wasn't sure another appointment was necessary. They could wait and see how she felt. I drove Mom to that specialist appointment myself. I made sure of it. The specialist was a geriatric internist named Dr. Bauer at Health Sciences North. He ran blood work. He asked Mom questions I sat in the corner and listened to without saying anything. Afterward, in the hallway, he asked if he could speak with me for a moment. He said the blood work showed some anomalies he wanted to investigate further. He said he wasn't drawing conclusions, but he wanted to repeat the tests in a controlled setting, meaning without any supplements or over-the-counter medications she might be taking that she hadn't mentioned. I asked what kind of anomalies. He mentioned elevated heavy metal markers. He kept his voice level. I drove home and sat in my parking lot again. I was shaking so badly I couldn't open my apartment door on the first try. The thing about building a case, and I had accepted by this point that that was what I was doing, is that you can't move until you have enough. I knew what the specialist's words pointed toward. I knew what Roland was doing, or what I believed he was doing. And I knew that if I called the police with what I had, which was a pattern of financial manipulation and one preliminary blood work result that a doctor had carefully not named as anything yet, Roland would be asked some questions, nothing would happen, and whatever chance I had of proving anything would evaporate. I called a lawyer. Not a criminal lawyer, I didn't know any, but the family lawyer who'd handled my dad's estate, a man named Jeffrey Stanhope in Sudbury who was in his 60s and had known my family for years. I went to his office and laid out everything I had, every note, every date, every text. He listened for a long time without interrupting. When I finished, he said he was going to give me the name of an RCMP officer he trusted in the fraud division and that I should make an appointment and bring my documentation. He also said, "Do not move too fast. Do not let Roland know you're doing this. Keep visiting, keep behaving normally, give the doctors time to do their work." I went home and I was sick in my bathroom, and then I washed my face and I drove back to Sudbury and I had dinner with my mom and Roland. And I helped with the dishes and I talked about nothing important and I watched Roland refill Mom's water glass and I smiled and said goodnight. I don't know how I held it together. I think the anger had gone somewhere very deep and quiet inside me, the way a river goes underground in winter. It was still moving. I could feel it. But it wasn't visible on the surface. The RCMP appointment was in September. I brought my folder. The officer, Constable Roland, was thorough and unhurried. She didn't dismiss anything I said. She told me that financial elder abuse was one of the most underreported crimes in Canada and also one of the hardest to prosecute because in many cases the victim had technically consented to the transactions. She asked if Mom had a general power of attorney, and I said not that I knew of, but I'd recently realized I should check. I checked. Roland had helped my mom execute a continuing power of attorney for property in March. 2 weeks after he'd introduced the investment brochure, I'd had no idea. Constable Roland made a note and said they'd be opening a file. Dr. Bauer's follow-up tests came back in October. The controlled blood work showed normal levels, meaning whatever had been elevated in August was no longer present when Mom wasn't taking the supplements Roland had been giving her. I quietly stopped giving her the ones he'd left in the medicine cabinet, telling Mom they might interact with something Dr. Bauer wanted to test. She'd accepted this without question. I'd put the supplements in a Ziploc bag and given them to Constable Renaud. The lab results on the supplements came back in November. I'm not going to list what was in them, because I still feel physically ill when I think about it. I will say that the concentrations were high enough that over several months, in a woman my mom's age with her particular health profile, the effects would have looked like natural cognitive decline. It would have looked like early dementia. It would have given Roland a reason to deepen his control over her affairs, and eventually it would have done more serious damage than that. Roland was arrested on a Wednesday morning in November. I wasn't there. Constable Renaud had specifically asked me to be elsewhere, both for my sake and because they didn't want any complications. I was at work, cleaning teeth, trying to keep my hands steady, when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that said, "Call me when you're free," and turned out to be Constable Renaud. He was charged with fraud over $5,000, criminal breach of trust, administering a noxious substance, and uttering forged documents. It turned out the power of attorney had procedural irregularities that suggested it had not been signed under entirely voluntary circumstances. I drove to Mom's house that evening. She opened the door and looked at me, and I could see she already knew. Constable Renaud had spoken with her that afternoon with a victim services worker present. She looked smaller than I remembered her looking. She stepped aside to let me in, and I walked past her into the kitchen and stood at the sink for a moment, looking out at the backyard, at the sagging porch, before I turned around. She said, "I feel so stupid." I said, "You're not stupid. You were lonely and he was patient, and he knew exactly what he was doing. That is not stupidity. That is predation." She started crying. I held her for a long time at the kitchen table. The investigation took months. During that time, I helped Mom apply to have the power of attorney revoked, contacted the Ontario Securities Commission about the investment vehicle, and worked with a civil lawyer to attempt recovery of the $50,000. Roland had moved some of it, but not all. A portion was recovered through a court order. The investment was exactly what my contact had suspected, an unregistered scheme that had already been flagged by securities regulators in 2 other provinces. Roland wasn't the originator, but he was a knowing participant, and there were other victims besides my mother. 4 other women, ranging in age from 61 to 79 across northern Ontario. He'd found them the same way he'd found her, through grief, through isolation, through the particular vulnerability of women who lost someone and hadn't yet figured out what their life looked like without that person. He was convicted the following October on 3 of the 4 charges. The judge and I was there for the sentencing, sitting 2 rows back with my hands folded in my lap and the river still moving somewhere underneath. Described the conduct as a gross and calculated abuse of trust against people who were least equipped to defend themselves, and sentenced him to 4 years at Beaver Creek Institution, plus restitution orders. 4 years felt short. I'd be lying if I said it didn't. Some of the comments I later read on a victims advocacy forum I joined said the same thing. The sentence never quite feels like enough when you've watched it happen in slow motion and know how close things came to being far worse. But here is what I know. My mom sold the house on Elm Street. The porch had gotten worse, and she was ready for something smaller anyway, and moved into a condo in Sudbury's South End, 10 minutes from me. She has a financial advisor now, a real one, registered with FSRA now, a real one, registered with FSRA, referred by the credit union. She went back to her book club. She called her sister Helen and they talked for 2 hours, and cried, and made plans for Helen to come in the spring. I still show up on weekends. We still drink tea at the kitchen table. She still puts too much sugar in hers, which she's been doing my whole life, and I still don't say anything about it. Some things you learn to carry quieter, but you carry them and you keep going, and the people you love are still there when you come home. I still think about the moment Roland said she already signed it over. That easy, unbothered confidence in his voice, like the outcome was so settled, it wasn't even worth discussing. He believed that. He'd spent months making sure it would be true. And for a while, sitting in that lawyer's office with my hands in my lap, I almost believed it too. What I've come to understand is that people like Roland don't succeed because they're exceptional. They succeed because they're patient, and because they count on the people around them being too stunned, too heartbroken, or too polite to look closely. He found my mom at her most vulnerable, a woman who'd spent 30 years building a quiet, careful life. And he dressed his intentions up as kindness. That's not cleverness. That's predation with a long timeline. I don't say this to diminish what happened. For a long time, I was angry at myself for not seeing it sooner. For every weekend, I drove home without asking the right question. But I've learned that guilt is only useful if it points somewhere. Mine pointed me toward a folder, a phone call, a constable named Renaud who took notes without dismissing a single thing I said. What actually worked wasn't rage. It wasn't confrontation. It was something quieter and more deliberate. The decision to document, to verify, to ask one more question instead of accepting a smooth answer. That took a kind of patience I didn't know I had. It also took being willing to look at something I desperately didn't want to see and keep looking anyway, even when I felt sick doing it. That's not heroism. That's just what you do when someone you love is in danger and you're the only one close enough to notice. My mom said she felt stupid. I think about that a lot. She isn't stupid. She's someone who trusted a person who had spent considerable effort earning that trust. The failure was his, not hers. But I understand why she felt it, because I felt a version of it too, the shame of having been close to something and not seen it clearly. What I've come to believe is that clarity isn't something you have or don't have. It's something you build slowly by asking questions and writing things down and calling the right people and refusing to let discomfort be a reason to stop. Mom goes to her book club now. She calls her sister on Sunday evenings. She made a lemon loaf last month and left half of it on my counter with a post-it note that said, "Stop feeding this to the dog you don't have." She's herself again, mostly. Some things did change. She's more careful now, more deliberate about who she lets in. I don't think that's damage. I think that's wisdom, earned the hard way. Roland will be out in a few years. I don't think about that often, and when I do, I put it back down. What matters is that the file exists, the record exists, the other 4 women who came forward exist. Whatever he does next, he does it without the infrastructure of secrecy he spent years constructing around my mom. That's enough. It has to be.